Well, this morning we're going to conclude the message series I've been doing about the relationship principles of Jesus. And, you know, if you and I believe, as we do, that Jesus was the Son of God, Jesus is God, Jesus is perfect, then when we look at the way in which Jesus related to people, the way he initiated those relationships, nurtured those relationships, the way he treated people, the way he responded to people, the way he communicated with people, it means that Jesus did all of that perfectly. And thus, if we look at Jesus, we see embodied and modeled for us the perfect way in which relationships can be created and can be sustained and can be enjoyed. And so over the past weeks, we've looked at things about forgiveness. We've looked at how Jesus had as his highest value relationships, communication, judging and not judging. And then last Sunday, of course, thinking about that in the teaching of Jesus, to be great is to be least. To be first means we desire to be last. And so this morning we're going to look at what we commonly call the golden rule. But as we do that, I want us to have the full context of what Jesus means by that. And so I would invite you to look and to read along as we hear from Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 36. Jesus said, "I tell you who hear me, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. For if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Give to everyone who asks you. And if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. But do to others as you would have them do to you." So there's the golden rule. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners, quote unquote, love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. So when we think about the golden rule, you know, the golden rule is often quoted. It's often quoted. You know, you see it engraved on buildings. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And typically in such situations like that, it's kind of a little pithy platitude that has just kind of been lifted out and put in place somewhere. But if we are to truly absorb what Jesus is meaning by the golden rule as he gives it here in the full context of Luke chapter 6, this is not a pithy platitude. This is not something that is meant to just kind of be memorized and just kind of casually thrown out there as some kind of just simple ethical principle. And so I want us to think deeper and deeply about what Jesus is seeking to tell us here in this matter of the golden rule. And some folks have suggested that while the golden rule is out there, we tend from time to time to live in concert with some other rules. And I looked at a writer and he gave 3, and I put them in your worship guide this morning. The reciprocal rule: what you do for me, I will do for you. The golden rule is not about reciprocity. The golden rule is not about returning a favor. A kindness was shown to me, and thus I'm going to show a kindness now back to you. That is not what Jesus is teaching here. And so we're not talking about the reciprocal rule. There's the ricochet rule. Do to someone based on what someone has done to you. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we can live with any of these lesser rules, the ricochet rule. I'm going to act based on how others have acted toward me. And reminded of the old joke about the husband who comes home from work, and man, he's just been an awful day. He's just had an awful day at work. And so anyway, he comes through the front door, and his wife, she had been at work, but she beat him home, so she's there in the living room, and so she kind of greets him, and you know, how was your day? Well, I mean, he just unloads. He just unloads. Grumbling, angry, frustrated, he just roars it out. Well, that puts her in a bad mood, and then her daughter comes into the kitchen and says something, and she snaps at the daughter. That puts the daughter in a bad mood. She goes and kicks the dog, and that puts the dog in a bad mood, and the dog goes to her bedroom and bites the head off the Barbie doll. The moral of the story, everybody would have been so much better off if when the dad had come home, he had just gone to the bedroom and bitten the head off the Barbie doll. But that's the way sometimes we operate. We just ricochet around based on how we've been treated, and so we just bring that baggage and just sling it around on everybody else. Then there's the hidden motive rule. And this is where it can get a little squirrely. The hidden motive rule. I act like I'm doing for you, but it's really to get what I want. I act like I'm doing to you or for you, but it's really to get what I want. You know, there are some corporations, there are some companies that claim the golden rule as their chief principle for conducting business. And, you know, I mean, that's somewhat admirable. For example, the Hilton Corporation has as their motto for the practice of hospitality, the golden rule. You know that when J.C. Penney first opened his department store, he called it the Golden Rule Store. And his little chain of 2 or 3 stores started out as the Golden Rule Store, and then ultimately he attached his name to it and it became J.C. Penney. All right, well, I get that. But the Golden Rule, as espoused by Hilton and by J.C. Penney Department Store, is with the angle that if we do unto you as we would like for you to do unto us, what we're really after is a repeat customer. Right? So there's a hidden motive. There's a hidden motive. If Hilton really wanted to live out the Golden Rule, their corporate execs would spend the first few moments of every business day praying for the success of Holiday Inn. I doubt that happens. I doubt that happens. The hidden motive rule. I will do for you, but I'm really doing this because there's something I'm hoping to get from you. And then, of course, there's the old play on the golden rule, which is he who has the gold rules. So there's all kinds of rules out there. But this morning, again, I want us to think truly about what Jesus is commanding of us. This is not a suggestion, but that he is commanding of us regarding the golden rule. And this really needs to move from being a pithy platitude to being an attitude which guides and directs our daily lives. And I'm going to say 2 things this morning, 2 things to kind of get us started. One is, when you and I think about the context of the golden rule, I want you to know, and I'm going to say confessionally, and I'm going to admit right up front, I cannot do this. Nelson Harris cannot live out Luke chapter 6. So let me just read to you, and you ask yourself, is my natural inclination to do these things? Love your enemies. Everybody naturally disposed to do that one? Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. I just an inclination to love those who hate me. As a caveat, I'd like to say I hope that number is few and far between. But, so the place we begin here with the golden rule is that the only way that you and I are ever going to have this truly as our attitude is if Jesus gives us the power to live this rule. You and I cannot, on our own, live out Luke 6. It is only the power of God in us that will even make this a possibility. And I want you to kind of be reminded of this. This is true of the relationship principles we've been looking at that have been modeled by and commanded by Jesus Christ. It is not natural to seek the least spot. It is not natural to have a forgiveness towards someone that we, in our own natural lens, think should be unforgiven. It is not natural for us to be able to love in the capacity that Jesus loved us. And so we are reminded again through the context of the golden rule, the Christian life is never meant to be something we do on our own. The ethical, moral, relationship principles of Jesus Christ are meant to be lived and can only be lived in His power. You and I cannot do this in and of our own selves. It is only the power of God within us, as we have surrendered to that, that makes this a possibility, that puts us on that trajectory. Second thing that I would say as we look at the golden rule is not only do we need the power that Jesus can give to live this rule, but we have to be willing to take the first step. The golden rule is based upon the premise that you and I are the initiator. Otherwise, this is all about being reciprocal. I'm going to do something good because you did something good for me. The golden rule is based on you and I taking the first step. You and I initiating this principle in our relationship. So we want to begin with those kind of two foundational understandings relative to the golden rule. With that said, we now move to what the golden rule expresses, which is that real love, love as demonstrated and defined by Jesus Christ, is sacrificial, not reciprocal. Real love as defined by Jesus Christ is sacrificial, not reciprocal. As Christians, we think not about how we want to be treated only, but how Jesus treated people. Relationships are molded not by what we want, but by Jesus' example. And so this is really about much of what we began the service singing about, and that is love. About having the capacity to be able to love others as a reflection of God's love for us. And so real love, that kind of love, is sacrificial. It's not reciprocal. Secondly, the golden rule is only golden unless it applies to everyone. Unless it applies to everyone. And you know, Jesus understood us. Jesus understood us so much more than we even understand ourselves. I mean, he knew what our own natural inclinations were. And so I want you to listen from Matthew chapter 5. This is a portion of Scripture from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is essentially talking about the same thing that we find here in Luke chapter 6. But in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 38, Jesus says this, "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, Do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, as we've talked about before, whenever Jesus tees up a teaching with the phrase, "You have heard it said, but I say," that immediately clues us in. Jesus is about to change the standard. Jesus is about to raise the bar. He's going to move the plumb line to something higher and better than what was. And that is true here with the Golden Rule. Do you know that the Golden Rule, a lot of folks claim this, and it is true in a sense, in a variation is found in almost all of the world's religions. But Jesus changes the standard. Jesus changes the standard. In almost all other world religions, the variation of the Golden Rule is always expressed in the negative. Let me illustrate. In the first century, in the latter part of the first century, there was a rabbi by the name of Hillel, and he was considered to be quite a scholar. And so anyway, the story is told in the Talmud that a person approached the rabbi and said this. He said, "I want you to sum up for me all of the ethical teachings of your faith while I stand on one leg." Now, the reason he said, "while I stand on one leg," is he didn't want the good rabbi to go on and on and on. Do not stand on one leg. I know some of you are tempted to get up and try that. Do not do that this time. And this is what the rabbi said. And you will listen. This is a variation of the Golden Rule, but it is in the negative. Hillel said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to another." In other words, refrain from doing what you hope people will refrain from doing to you. You with me? Now, Jesus could have gone with that line of thinking, and he would have been in the mainstream of a lot of religious thought. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus says, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." I don't know about you, but for me, it's much more challenging, much more difficult to initiate an action towards the categories of people that Jesus opened up with in that body of teaching than it is to refrain from doing anything to that. So Jesus ups the standard. Jesus alters the expectation. Jesus says this isn't about not doing things that you don't want people to do to you. This is about initiating actions that you hope people might initiate toward you. Well, that's very different. That is very different. And again, just to call us back to the point that this is not a pithy platitude, but an attitude of living that can only be accomplished through God's power within us. When we think about loving enemies and blessing those who curse us and hate us and praying for those who mistreat us. And so the Golden Rule is only golden if we are willing to apply it to everybody. Not just our friends, not just our families, not just our favorite boss or the co-workers we like to have lunch with. Because Jesus would tell us this morning, well, anybody can do that. And they do. So the Golden Rule is only golden if we are willing to apply it to everybody. And then last, I want us to think about this. The goal of love is seeing God at work in our real lives. And I say that because so many times the way in which you and I operate when it comes to our actions or demonstrating or initiating love or a kindness to someone or grace to someone is if they will conform to our ideal for that. Well, as soon as they change their attitude, then you know. Well, as soon as they straighten up and fly right, then we'll be gracious, we'll be kind. And so a lot of times we think love operates as a response to circumstances or people or individuals conforming to this ideal we have for them and that we are imposing upon them for our love then and our grace to then be expressed to them. That's not what the Golden Rule is about. Because what happens when you and I get caught up in these ideals, as noble as they may be, is we make an idol out of the ideal and fail to see God at work in the real. You ever notice that whenever Jesus encountered someone in the Gospels, he always ministered to them, he loved them, he imbued grace toward them where they were as they were. And that's what the Golden Rule is about. It's about, through the eyes and the lens of real sacrificial love, seeing God at work in reality, in the lives of people as they are, where they are, just as Jesus did. Just as Jesus did. And so let us not think the Golden Rule is about only being loving and gracious to people when they comport to an attitude we think they ought to have. Jesus doesn't say, love your enemies as soon as they cease being your enemy. He says, love your enemies. This is hard stuff. Difficult stuff. Challenging stuff. All that can be done in the empowerment of God into our lives. I want to close with this illustration. Because I truly believe. You know who is ultimately blessed when the Golden Rule is truly practiced? The one who has obeyed the Golden Rule. That's who ultimately gets the most blessed. Will other people? Of course they will. But when we live out the teachings of Jesus Christ in the relationships that we have, I want to suggest to you that we will ultimately be blessed because of it. And you know, Jesus didn't teach or command anything that he didn't live by himself. When I think about that phrase, loving your enemies, you know, I immediately go to Jesus hanging upon the cross, where he looks out upon that crowd that's mocking him and ridiculing him and joking him and spitting upon him. And what does he say? He says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. So Jesus isn't asking anything of us, but what he did not model it himself. But when you and I live out the Golden Rule, ultimately the blessing comes to us. New York Times, several years ago, this was before the age of Uber. New York Times interviewed cab drivers in New York City. And they did a series of these interviews of cab drivers and asked them all kinds of questions about the experience of driving a cab in New York City and passengers and episodes that they had and all that. And you can only begin to imagine what cab drivers would begin to tick off in their careers of driving cabs in New York City. And one of the questions that the New York Times reporters asked of these cab drivers was favorite passengers, favorite moments, best fare, largest tip, all this kind of stuff. And so they interviewed this one cab driver. And he was a guy that drove what you and I might call the midnight shift. He didn't take his cab out of the garage until it was about 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. He didn't quit until it was about 7:30 or 8 o'clock the next morning. Now you can, again, only begin to imagine what a night